a couple minutes past 12:30, so we're going to get going because I know everyone's time is important. So we're going to start and want to officially welcome everyone to today's webinar to confidentiality and trust in condos. I am Sean Pulver. I am the president of CAI Canada and the principal of the Pulver on Condos law firm. The last few weeks, condos have certainly been in the news. It's good to see so much interest and passion in the condo world. At CAI Canada, we pride ourselves on being on top of current condo news and in providing our members and prospective members with valuable information and perspective. This webinar dives deep into the recent publicity and brings sharper focus to the risks, benefits, and future challenges for e-voting technology in condominium governance. In only a few years, we've developed a strong brand and have grown the first Canadian chapter of CAI. The growth has been due in part to our commitment to putting on first-rate events that feature a wealth of different topics. Just want to clarify, this is not a gotcha session. We're not pointing fingers or trying to create problems. We are trying to provide perspective, potential solutions from a wide range of speakers. Here we are looking at security and confidentiality from a property management angle, privacy angle, legal angle, and a journalistic angle. And my job is to moderate and treat this as a very interactive session. Finally, I want to thank Lash Condo Law as the lead sponsor and to our new operations management touchpoint. And we are very, very lucky to have five fantastic speakers, one of which is kind of in the World Wide Web, is tangled up right now in it and trying to get logged back onto our system. So we currently have myself in our four, and our fifth member will be on momentarily. We're trying to figure out another way to get them back logged in. So what we're going to do is our speakers are each going to go for about 3 minutes or so to do an introduction. And we're going to, at that point, kind of have some back and forth conversation between the panel. I'm going to jump in from here and there to add some context. And we're going to try to leave at least 15 minutes. We have an hour. We're finishing today at 1:30. If there are questions that are brought up during the seminar, I'll do my best to incorporate those into the session. Just to introduce your panel, we have Shane Digman, who's a reporter at the Globe and Mail. We have Claudio, who is a cyber and security expert, Claudio Popa, and he is going to be speaking second. We have Rod Escaiola, partner at Gowlings, who is currently slotted as the third speaker, and that could vary depending on his getting logged in. We have William Stratus at Eagle Audit, and finally we have Julian McNabb at Melbourne Property Management. So we're gonna, without further ado, start with Shane, and Shane, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, folks. It's funny, I've had more than one person ask me, like, why was this even news? I wrote a story about some of these issues in digital voting and sort of digital meetings, and the question came back to me, who cares, I mean, really, how some condo corporations govern themselves? These are individual corporations. Why is this in the public interest? And sort of the simple answer I had for that is that more people live in condos in Ontario every year. There's some estimates that suggest almost 300,000 condo units have been added to the GTA alone in the last 20 years. So right or wrong, people don't tend to tip off the newspaper about a condo corporation that's running just fine. It's difficult to be sure sometimes that, but it does seem that most condos in the province operate reasonably well. But in those cases where there are problems, oftentimes you can see that our systems for governing and regulating the condo space can play a role in some of those bad outcomes. Now, I'm not a policymaker, and so if you ask me what the right system is for transitioning to a more sort of fair or digital form of voting, I don't really have a prescription. But what I do have is questions. The first one sort of is, do condo voters want privacy, clarity, and security in their elections? Should a condo election be more like, say, a municipal, provincial, or federal election? And if you have to have proxies, which most condo corporations do, should they be treated like other ballots that are private until all the other votes are cast? I mean, these are all good questions, but I think we should also ask just the basic structure of what are these elections? Should they be treated like a shareholders meeting in a public company where management has a lot more control over the control and collection of proxies for any given meeting than a regular democratic election might? And then they can use that control and that early access to maybe, push the sort of shareholder intention one way or the other to gain advantage when it comes time to whip votes or withdraw from areas where they might face defeat. It's a question I think everybody who lives in condos, who works in the condo space, who serves on a board in a voluntary capacity, they have to start asking themselves these questions. And I think the reason we shouldn't be asking these questions is I don't think it's wise that we leave it up to every single one of the thousands of condo corporations in this province and across the country to write their own rules on this. Even if you have some of the larger property management firms out there guiding this market, maybe by setting their own policies or vendor lists, that's also still a fragmented approach. So if e-voting and digital meetings are the way of the future, it seems that perhaps some basic guidelines on what it takes to have a fair and valid meeting need to be established when you're talking about this digital space, so that every condo voting member in the province can expect the same treatment of their ballot. I think that's the main reason I wrote about this story and why I'm interested in this seminar. Thanks.
Thank you, Shane. And we've got Rod back, so crisis averted. So Shane, thank you. So Claudio, the virtual floor is now yours. I think you're muted.
Yes, there are two levels of mute because we live in pandemic times and you can never trust just one. So yes, there's a hard mute and a soft mute. There are different cameras, multiple laptops. You never know. My name is Claudio Popa. I'm a security and privacy expert, or so they say. I've been in the business for about 20 to 30 years, and today I specialize in data protection. It's the interesting thing about the topic that we're talking about is that it spans such a broad landscape. It's not just about protecting data, it's about controlling how it's shared. So it has privacy implications, it has surveillance implications, it has promotion implications, it has data safety, data integrity. It's about the different flavors of security. And so the reason I'm here today, and if anyone takes anything away from what I have to say on this day, it's the fact that it's not just one word. It's not just, well, we treat this with the utmost privacy. What does that mean? Or your data is secure with us. What does that mean? There are nuances to these terms that I want everyone to at least be aware of, right? So we talk about security as a term that is used to derive and generate trust. We talk about privacy rights and privacy compliance. Those are two different things. Again, it's within the realm of how do you build trust and how do you retain that trust? Well, how you do it is with a foundation of proper security controls. And without getting technical, the idea here is that there are facets to security. One of them you may have heard of, which is confidentiality. A lot of people see a blurry line between confidentiality and privacy. I assure you they're two distinct things. One is a right and the other one is a safeguard. We have the idea of possession and control, which is likely going to be part of our discussion today. Who's got access to the information and who controls that information? Where is it sitting exactly? Is it in the cloud? And if so, how many different parties have access to it? Data integrity is key. If multiple parties have access to it and it could be modified or it could be corrupted or it could be changed before or after, let's say, a specific threshold or let's say a vote, then does it decrease the value of that data? Of course it does. Data authenticity. Is it reliable enough that you know whether you can trust it? Is its provenance what you think it is? Is that proxy vote worth as much as the original intended vote? Is proxy itself a trustworthy mechanism? Data availability and data utility are the final two, right? If it's not available, if a system is not in place, or you have a system that's supposed to be available at a particular time and it's not there, what happens? Do you lose votes? Do you lose all the data? Is there a potential for this whole thing to no longer work? And finally, the utility of the data. There are different parties involved, and different aspects of the information are useful to different people in different organizations. We need to understand what the motivations are in order to protect it adequately. Happy to discuss all of these in a little bit, but I hope that was an okay introduction, and I cede the floor.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much. That's very interesting, and it'll be great to kind of take that and see some other comments from the rest of the panel. And we've got Rod next. Rod,
Okay,
the floor is
hello.
yours.
Thanks so much. I finally made my way into this webinar. I thought for a second maybe the Freedom Truckers in Ottawa were preventing me from connecting, but here I am. So let me start by saying this. There was a lot of drama last month when the news first broke out, and rightfully, and a lot of people were upset and rightfully. But I'm going to just say this before I dive in. I'm not going to take sides here, and I'm not sure that the blame should fully rest on managers. I know it seems like they got all the attention, all the managers trying to get to the information. And somehow they were seen as maybe the driving force that was interested. And we also heard some sort of rumblings that some service providers were losing the gig if they were to tell the managers, no, you're not going to get to see behind the curtain. I'm just going to say this about the managers. I don't think they're getting paid enough to really care about who's going to get elected at the end of the day. The true driving force, the ones interested in knowing the outcome ahead of time, are the ones running, presumably the candidates. So I just want to sort of maybe start with that bit of a caution, because I felt maybe the focus may have been unjustly sort of on condo managers in some of the reports, not necessarily from the Globe and Mail, but like sort of the rumblings I saw on social media. So this is what we have, folks. We have a typical case of technology having been outrun by legislation. And it's hard to believe when you think about it, because this legislation is about 5 years old. But the pandemic has totally changed the landscape, and it's pushed us forward into a universe that we never really thought existed 2.5 years ago. And so when the Condo Act was amended and when the Condo Management Services Act was enacted, at the time the province was focusing on proxies, because in those days, the voting system was really binary. You either voted in person, and we expected the scrutineers to keep you in line, or you voted in absentia by submitting paper proxy. Now, of course, paper proxies were fraught with abuse. People were seeking to control the outcome. People knew which way you voted ahead of time, and you had these people showing up at the meeting 5 minutes before the AGM with a hockey bag full of proxies. And so that's what the province focused its attention on at the time, the proxies, the paper proxies. But this is no longer the weapon of choice now. The weapon of choice is voting electronically. This is how people get elected now. This is the system that are being developed, thankfully, rightfully. And that system is going to stay, I think, the e-voting. So focusing now on what we have at hand is, how do we fix this going forward? If you have legislation that's been totally outrun by technology, and if the legislation at the time only focused on the known evil, which was the paper proxy, how do we fix this going forward? Now, thankfully, the province is kind of consulting right now as we speak. Okay, so how are we going to regulate voting going forward? How are we going to regulate the electronic votes and so on and so forth? And unfortunately, I fear that the province is going to be very timid. I mean, we've seen drafts of the legislation that's going to come down the pike. And the draft basically says, yeah, sure, you can vote electronically, go right ahead. And if that's where we stop, if we're only focused on the fact that, yes, you can vote electronically, but we don't tell people what that means and how that works, that's going to be really problematic going forward. Now, the issue, of course, that everybody is aware, and that's why you're all connected today, is that it appears that certain providers, I'm not going to point a finger, I don't care which one there are, but certain providers may have allowed people to see the results ahead of time or get some information ahead of time. And if you ask anyone Anyone that cast a vote, no one, there's not a single soul that would accept that. This goes against the very basic tenets of democracy. If someone has advanced information, and I got to tell you that if you follow me on social media, not too long ago, I was of the view that, well, maybe quorum is the only piece of information that we should access ahead of time. And I'm not too sure. I'm still in agreement with myself, even on that front. Now, the issue is this: if it's feasible, if the technology allows people to have access to the vote, of course the temptation is too hard to resist. So we really need to regulate the service providers, because I'm not blaming them, but you can't let technology regulate itself. I'm almost done, Sean. I know Sean is like sort of a Rod, like keep some dessert for later, but I'm just going to say this. When we developed bylaws back when bylaws were required to vote electronically, we focused on what we felt were paramount safeguards if you're going to vote electronically. We wanted transparency, accountability, confidentiality, reliability, and record keeping. And I'm going to say this as to conclude my tirade, and I may live to regret this one day, but the province should pay as much attention now when it regulates electronic voting as it did when it attempted to regulate proxies. That is where all the attention should be, and they should be as micromanaging as they were at the time when they regulated proxies. There it is, Sean.
Thanks, Rod. There's plenty more for us to get to, but we're going to now move to William, who I think has a couple of slides. So he's going to do a share screen.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to ask the audience if you're familiar with the top right of your screen. If you see a little command that says view, you should probably pick speaker as the preferred view. If you see it at the top right of your Zoom, okay? So I just have a few little things that can spice it up a little in a constructive way. So here it comes. So the news headlines were, there I am. The news headlines are what they are. If any, I wanted to say, if anybody didn't get access to the Globe, you can email me at help@eagleaudit.ca. I'll send you a print copy, a PDF of that article, or the CTV news.
Distributing our stuff, William. Come on now.
Well, I'm a 30-year subscriber, so there's a few perks. But I hear what you're saying. It comes with a proviso to it. Don't worry. So thank you, Shane. He's always good. So here we go. So in the CTV news article, I was quoted accurately from my public interest whistleblower disclosure. As you see, this quote is really the central element. It's a concern about the potential to compromise fundamental fairness and confidentiality across every election in every condo in our province. That is the germinal issue that spurred me to take action in the public interest. And specifically in my document, I want to draw attention to the one key paragraph. The concerns focus on risks potentially posed by all e-voting platforms because, in my opinion, all of them have failed to transparently demonstrate that they can be trusted to operate fair and confidential vote tabulations in condo elections. And this is fairly easily observed. So, for example, does anyone actually know how these platforms operate? Here's Hillary Clinton still looking for her 30,000 emails. But frankly, that's a really valid question, because the technology behind them, as we've learned in the Facebook fiasco and countless other horrible scandals out there involving the collision of technology and society, the potential to do good or evil exists in all of these tools. It's really the fundamental question of our time across everything we do every day. So consider the scenario: disclosing of vote choices of individual owners, whatever the method, whatever the justification. Or worse, consider this: developing voting profiles of individual owners from year to year. In other words, developing what you might call a political manifesto of every single condo owner. Could you do that? I can tell you the technology exists to do that. This would be diabolical if somebody was creating political profiles of condo owners. The same same diabolical consequence would occur if there was political profiles kept of your voting behavior in provincial or federal elections. Could you think it's inconceivable, but it is possible. So these are valid questions. And where they lead to is the question of trust. Trust but verify. I love the old days when 1985 summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, and Reagan's constant mantra was this proverb in Russian, dobraya no proverya, trust but verify, regarding nuclear de-escalation and arms reduction. Same thing applies here. Technical practices of the e-voting platforms, in my view, must be transparently disclosed and independently verified. This kind of ties back to what Rod just said a moment ago, advocating for regulations for the providers. Interesting. But what is the real operations behind these platforms? And multiple other issues. We can touch on these in the subsequent questions. The role of scrutineers. You know, independent scrutineers drawn from the owner population is really vital for trust in the outcome. These platforms don't provide any of that, to my knowledge. Autocratic chairpersons, the ability to kill people's right to speak, or even disregard questions completely without care. What about the kind of motion that's legal and possible, replacing the chair in a meeting? I have actually replaced 2 condo lawyers in condo elections for client corporations by the vote of the floor. So how does the chair of an electronic meeting hand over to me as the newly elected chair of the owners meeting? That is a legal motion. How is that going to be handled? And vote accessibility, what that means is telephone access. What about people that have no computer? I know several in my own condo. They voted and they came in last time on telephone. Equal participation. That includes visual impaired people. We must not disregard accessibility as we all rush into the embrace of technology. Next, in closing, I just want to mention Onyx Condo Management was quoted in the articles, and they issued a statement to their licensees and their employees. They do not believe, this was a statement they released to the press, and they do not believe there's any principled basis for allowing board members or managers to be informed of advanced election results. Now, that's a declaration from a provider in Waterloo, Kitchener, a visionary company in my view. But where's the leadership from other licensed management companies? I am not aware of anyone else in the business actually making a declaration to their employees and their licensees in such a overt and public way. I would love to know if someone has, please inform me. But this is the kind of leadership that I think we also need to see in this business, because ultimately the trust of owners is reposed in management, and the trust in property managers and the professionalism, it's all a big circle. So where do they stand in this whole question regarding their own employees and their own practices that they either turn a blind eye to or that they prohibit or permit? So I fully adopt the adoption of these technologies, but I believe much more work is needed before they can be fully trusted with the democratic process in every condo in our province. Thank you.
Thanks, William. There's a lot to digest there, and we'll try to get to some of these issues before we finish at 1:30. So our last speaker now, we've got Julian from Melbourne.
Geez, I'd hate to be the speaker from a management company who had to follow that William Stratus there, but no, and that's a really good point, William. And I know that you and I email corresponded pretty much immediately after that Globe and Mail article was released. And I said, what would you do? You know, you're an auditing firm. We respect what you've done in the industry over the years. And that's the first thing he said to me, is you need to create a policy for your organization that when you're entering into an agreement with a company that is going to provide e-voting or other services, you need to make sure that you do have a policy that they follow, not dissimilar from tendering any other contract. If you're tendering a snow clearing contract or anyone else that the condominium depends on, you need to make sure that you've got guidelines in place. So we certainly have taken that on board. We didn't do it publicly. We just made sure that we did it within our own organization. A couple of points I wanted to make. So I was actually thinking after we had the discussions and we read this and went through it with my team and sort of where are we? Where do we end up? Because I think a lot of the managers that are on this call genuinely want help. They genuinely want to do their jobs better. We are trying to be more professional. And I think it all sort of starts around, as Rod alluded to, the new legislation. I remember, like almost every manager who's been on this call, rapidly knocking on doors, trying to get those extra proxies, just trying to get quorum so we could actually have an annual general meeting of the owners. And voter apathy, voters show up. People just were not interested in attending these meetings at all. We've almost come so far since then that now we're questioning the voting and everything. And how did this be? There's a couple of points that I want to make. Obviously, there's the changes to the condo market. I want to briefly touch on changes to the Ontario housing market. Now, if you look at the demographic of who's living in condominiums today versus 5 or 10 years ago, it's very different. There are a lot more people now who are considering a condominium as their home, not as a passage in life to a future home. What does that mean for condo managers? It means that the people who are living in the buildings have a more active role. They want to be a little bit more involved. The voter apathy is sort of slipping away and more resident engagement. I was speaking with a colleague at another management company recently who said, look, we've been inundated with requests for records. People are interested in what's going on with their condominiums like never before. And you throw on top of that the pandemic, where people are working from home. And so now, absolutely, this has become a top of mind topic. So I'm really pleased that this was brought up because it is very timely. The pandemic has sort of forced everyone to focus on these issues. Now, as a manager, our roles in general, the manager needs to be trusted. You've got to be able to trust your manager. You need to have transparency as a manager, and you need to be really good at communication because you need to share with your constituents and share with the residents and the owners what's happening. So, when it comes to online voting, a lot of the time management companies will trust that third-party provider to collect proxies, to do the voting in good conscience. And as Claudio and as William sort of alluded to, we need to make sure perhaps that there are some policies and protocols in place. I think the management industry would welcome that. I think it would be a peace of mind for the contractors that we're using and the vendors that we're using to provide this service, knowing that if there was government regulation that's required to offer that service, I think it'd be really helpful. It would take a big load off our plate. Certainly, in the past with proxies, we probably had the potential to look at them. And I don't think it was even something that people were considering. It was more, the focus was always on quorum, making sure we can have the meeting. And now it's more about, let's get more people involved in the meeting. Let's have more people have access to the voting. And I think the natural evolution of that is, okay, let's make sure it's done in a way and a manner that everyone can feel comfortable, and it's done responsibly, and it's done keeping those privacy concerns in line. I think that's, those are some really good points as to why we're here today. I've lost you, Sean.
Sean's muted.
What we're going to do is, so we've got in our kind of remaining half an hour, I'm going to throw some points out to the group, get some back and forth. I encourage if there are some questions. I think the chat has been disabled, but the Q&A should be working. If anyone wants to put some questions in there while we're talking, please feel free to do so on that feature. So let me start off and ask a few questions to the group, and we can see. So question one: what's the is consensus, if there is one, on whether the paper proxy should be removed altogether? Is it something that's just creating more problems than it's worth, and should the focus be on having the technology improved, and to the point that William had, to making sure that those, there are other alternatives, phone, other ways that people who have inability to have a computer log on can also be protected. So let me start. I'll go with in the order of we start. So Shane, we'll go with you first. Do you think that would help?
It's a good question. It's funny. I've talked to some folks like yourselves who described the new proxy form can be complicated, devilishly complicated. Like people who don't know how to fill it out, has trouble. If you're following the strict letter of the law, you might disqualify a number of these proxies, you know, that you get at a typical meeting, the paper ones, for not being filled out correctly. I don't really have a view as to whether you need to get rid of proxies or not, other than I understand the big reason for them is because of this historical issue of not being able to get quorum. You know, like that's a really big challenge, particularly as you have buildings now that get sold, you know, 70% of them are by investors who are not going to live in the building, you know. So it's a challenge to get quorum out of like sort of owners if many of them have no connection to the actual building other than ownership.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
will just say that just as closing on this is like, I think that the big thing I always come back to is complexity is the enemy of accountability. So if you get a complex system like a proxy, you can find ways to mess it up.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, one thing that I don't know for those that have been involved, I haven't been as much with you know, any proposed legislation changes, but I mean, even the idea of quorum, you know, it's based on a specific percentage that applies to every condo, whether it's a rented property, a commercial property, residential. I mean, that's probably something that could be considered as well, to say in certain environments, you know, when a building hits a certain threshold, for example, of rental properties, should the quorum be the same? I mean, you're right. A lot of the downtown properties are, in the past, I've gone to one site several times and they couldn't get quorum because of the amount of tenants. It was just impossible. So that's an interesting item. I don't know if it's ever been raised for those that are advocating on the legislation side. So let's go. Sorry, William, you had your hand up.
Yeah, well, I think proxies are a total anachronism. I think they've been superseded by the opportunity for owners to vote electronically or by telephone on a direct manner. But if you wanted a hybrid option, perhaps proxies for quorum only. Okay.
Yeah.
There is such a preponderance of fraud in proxies. It's a complete and utter disaster. Eagle Audit has been and continues to be involved in those kind of matters. It is a whole giant mess. Okay. And I believe technology has leapfrogged it. Okay. So the other element to this, I think we might have a different opinion about proxies if the CAO had actually redesigned that horrible 3-page form properly. You know, part of the problem here from day one, 4 years ago, was that form was universally condemned, including by one of the leading condo lawyers who took it as a personal cause. But I don't see the proper usability coming in that form. And the government, the ministry handed off to CAO, I believe, a year and a half ago or so. Nothing's happened. If that form was not as evil and shockingly ineffective and unfriendly as it presently is, maybe, you know, you wouldn't have the same level of problem.
Let's go back to Rod. What's your, I'm sure you have an opinion on, I know you have an opinion on this, but it's the attendees that may not have heard it.
Yeah, so let me say this. I mean, it's no secret. I think the proxies are a total utter disaster, and I actually think they're anti-democratic. Actually, there is no form of democracy that allows you to delegate to someone the authority to vote for you. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I'm this close to starting to swear in French here. It's just anti-democratic. It has all the pitfalls and problems that we were criticizing last month about advanced voting and access to information. I'm going to go down the hallway. I'm going to control and get access to this advanced information by having a proxy knowing very well which way you voted. And we're kind of leaving it to different factions. We're letting them police their own sort of proxy collections. Like, that makes absolutely no sense. And I would only allow proxies for quorum purpose only. And that to me is what proxies aim to serve, quorum, but don't give your vote away. Like, that's just dumb.
Okay, Julian, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I'm a little trepidatious. I don't like proxies. They're a pain for managers. They're not fun. But I'm also thinking of some of the people in our communities who may not have a very good grasp of the English language, may be elderly, and they want to provide their children with the proxy so the children can go down to the meeting and vote on their behalf. I can see circumstances where they may work. I agree with everybody on the call that the technology and the solutions today, you know, proxies may have been the ideal solution 30 years ago for the scenario I just described, But in today's day and age, where everyone can actually interact with the meeting, they can do it from their own home, and we've got, you know, checks and balances and hopefully some regulation potentially. I really think that they are on their last leg and should be used as a last resort. I really like William's idea of making them just for quorum, because as a manager, we didn't care who they voted for. We just cared that we could have the meeting to make sure that it was a good use of everybody's time. And to Rod's point, yeah, if you want to give away your vote, like all you really want to do is give away your consent to have a vote that you won't be involved in because you're not there in person. So I think there's a happy medium, but I think as we lean and we talk about this out loud, we're moving more towards an environment where they are no longer relevant.
And as a follow-up, because I know there were some questions in our Q&A we'll get to about accessibility. I mean, I understand that there's some providers that have phone, for example, which seems to me to be a great idea. If you can directly do it and put in your own vote by someone in phone or by way of phone, that, you know, that's another option if someone doesn't have accessibility to a computer. And I think the government, if they open up for suggestions, you know, anything that lets somebody do it directly who doesn't need to do it on a piece of paper and doesn't have access to a computer. I mean, there's got to be other solutions, you would think. So Claudio, you're the last comment on this proxy. I don't know if you have any thoughts to the paper, or if you want to look at it more from a security perspective.
Well, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I do want to look at it from a security perspective. And again, these are quantitative metrics for me. While people see trust as it's either untrusted or it's trusted, I see it as various levels of trustworthiness. And I think Shane nailed it when he said that there's an implication of complexity here. The implication of complexity is not necessarily that the proxy process is not, it cannot be trusted. The implication is that it's a different dynamic, and that dynamic comes with different degrees of risk. Earlier I talked about the authenticity of something. If a proxy vote, for example, is disputed, somebody might say, well, I sent grandpa to vote and he voted the wrong way because it was confusing, or he's colorblind, or something to that effect. The utility of the information is eroded. The integrity of the data is questioned, right? Because it's no longer the same data that it was intended to be. As Julian said, if you give away your vote, then you're giving away the right to communicate that same information. So in security, we do have something called harmonization of risk. And if we've got two ways of doing things, inevitably you're going to have two uneven levels of risk, and somebody, when they build a system or when they build a process, will have to understand the fact that this risk is not a Boolean thing, either yes or no, but it comes with different levels of trust. And if those levels are different, then you have to build controls in place to compensate for the fact that somebody might vote on behalf of someone else and they might misrepresent themselves, or they might have influenced the original individual, or vice versa. And of course, that's without even going into the confidentiality issue, where people can see how proxy votes are cast and who's voting in one direction or another, as William said. So it's a bit of a cluster bomb, and it's difficult to get your head around it from a system engineering perspective. And of course, as I'm talking, you can see that there have always been these concerns around proxies. It didn't have to happen when technology took over, but going forward, we're going to have these challenges presented by the added complexity and the risk delta that this represents.
Perfect. I had a question here. It's a good one for the panel as well. So in the olden days, if somebody had a paper proxy system and then they asked to see the ballots and the proxies after the election, Usually there's an exemption where you shouldn't be able to see who voted for who, so there could be some redactions, but at least there was some paper record. What's the current process now if somebody's not happy with an election result and makes a request for records? What is that person even able to see? Because there's not been a scrutineer involved. Are they just getting an electronic list from the provider of totals? Is that, maybe we'll start with either, maybe we'll start with Julian. What's your experience in that from sites you've managed? Have there been any reviews from the results from an electronic provider?
Yeah, so this conversation does raise obviously the question of the scrutineer. And who is the scrutineer? Because the same person that we're entrusting to hold, potentially chair and run the meeting is also doing the scrutineering. So at the end of the meeting, we would be provided with information. We'd be provided with like a PDF that would be emailed that talks about statistics, talks about this many people came in. They track IP addresses to make sure that everything is done correctly. It is a meaningful piece of data. Like, it does make sense. You can read it. It's like, okay, yep, we had this many people voted here, here, and here. We had quorum. It doesn't, it doesn't give you the details of who voted for who, but it's not something that you could really question. Certainly as a manager, like, it's a spreadsheet. It's like a financial statement that I'm given, and you're reading the financial statement, and here it is. And if you want to peel back the curtain, fortunately, in all the elections that I've been involved with, there hasn't been anything super duper contentious. So that it has probably avoided this comment, this sort of questioning. But I think this topic, and this is a great question to bring up in this forum.
You haven't been involved in a site where anyone has been demanding to go behind the list, from your experience yet with
Correct.
Electronic providers.
Correct.
Rod, you had your hand up, and then I'll go to William. Sorry.
Right, and so I'm going to say that this is going to be. There's already litigation. There's been tons of litigation surrounding proxies. I pity the poor fool that's going to be the first one to lead a litigation on the electronic sort of platforms and voting. I mean, it's going to be far more complicated. At least in the old days, you just show up with the proxies, and even then, sometimes you had writing experts. But now you're going to need people like Claudio to sort of show up and start giving us sort of some evidence. And if you have to start tracing IP addresses and this and that and the other, that's going to be. We're not about to simplify things. As next litigation pertaining to, like, in a very heated sort of litigation, it's going to be an expensive piece of litigation, I think.
Yeah, just to jump on that part just before William goes, but like, yeah, this idea, we trace the IP. I mean, I used to cover technology. It is very easy to spoof an IP, and more importantly, if you have an IP address, it can be meaningless if you voted from like a public service. There's man-in-the-middle attacks so that somebody can use your IP to vote from your place. There's all manner of ways that like interventions can happen in technology. And so Rod's right, it's going to be a total mess if somebody challenges an electronic result.
William?
Yeah, it might be a mess, but it's possible. And one avenue potentially is to go to court for an inspector with some pretty strong statutory powers to delve into the real mechanics of it. But I just want to mention, I am aware of one electronic platform that a day after the election actually reversed the result. There was a giant snafu involving proxies, of all things, and the input of the proxy totals and whatever, they actually changed the result the day after. So the role of some form of scrutineer, I think, is absolutely vital.
Interesting. Any other comments on that before I want to get to some questions that have been raised?
If I could add one other thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes to the previous talk. I want to remind everyone the advantage of these electronic platforms is the ability to vote up to 15 days prior to the election. And that is parallel to the right of municipal, federal, and well, certainly provincial and federal voters to vote either at the returning office or in the multiplicity of advance polls that are open up to 3 weeks before Election Day. So electronic voting is parallel in terms of almost unlimited opportunity, which further deprecates the need for proxy. You have literally, 15 days or more to cast some form of vote 24 hours a day at the convenience of wherever you are in the world. You can't beat that with paper.
Let me throw something else out at the group. There was a comment before, I think it was William, talking about, you know, further legislation, further, you know, oversight down the road. Right now, I mean, owners are paying for fees for things such as CEO. I guess it's paid through, I think it's through purchase of units, and then maybe, I mean, someone like Julian may be better to speak to it of how it's funded exactly per unit, but
it's annually per unit. The
it's
CAO
still an annual
everybody.
fee.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think the owner reaction would be if CEO takes more of a role, but then there's an additional fee, kind of an election related fee that they charge, and it costs more money? I mean, do you think that would be money well spent?
Look, the feedback I've had from boards and residents on the CAO and the CMREO is definitely positive. It's at least there's an official body you can go to get information. Yes, you can go there and download a 3-page proxy form. You can look at information. So I think the expectation is that these government bodies would review issues as they arise. And as Rod alluded to, they are, you know, starting to reach out to industry experts in the industry to talk about, you know, enhancing and changing. The CAT is constantly increasing their jurisdiction on issues that they can handle to alleviate some of the court systems with condo related matters. So I don't think this is the case of charging an additional fee. I think it's using some of the resources, the advisory boards that they have at hand to enhance the system. Because again, you know, I have to firmly believe that all the changes that came in at the end of 2017 are to increase the professionalism of this industry, is to provide a better service and more accountability, and to make, you know, to help boards and residents trust their managers and work with their managers. So, you know, again, to Rod's point, if we can get the managers, you know, compensated to match what their, you know, the expectations are, I think together we'll move this really in the right direction.
Yeah, Sean.
I'm curious. One follow-up. I'm curious the group's opinion, and may start with Claudio on this point. Is historically you had situations where, you know, when we were on the paper system in particular, people would be collecting, you know, going around the building trying to collect large groups of proxies. If you're doing stuff electronically, I mean, I guess you could be you know, advocating your role, but you're still have to get that person or persons you're talking about to log on and vote. You can't collect 30 votes. So the question is, if we're now in more of a technological, you know, environment, online environment, should there be more of a opportunity for owners to communicate with one another and to do it, you know, online or email, or should they have more access to other owners now because there may not, you know, be any value in going door to door? I mean, should that change now the way that people campaign and actually advocate for their role on the board? Thoughts, William?
Yes. Well, you know, the suppression of owner participation occurs in many buildings far before the date of the AGM. And it's most draconian in those buildings where they have swipe cards on the elevators that completely, and lock doors on the fire exits to re-enter corridors, where literally it is completely impossible to even put a note under somebody's door. And the suppression of communication is a very, very disturbing component to this. I don't believe, though, that a chat room can substitute, because, Sean, I'm sure you know very well the dangers of these open discussion chat rooms, which quickly devolve into massive disasters on the level of Twitter and all that kind of thing. So I don't believe there is a technological solution to what you say, but I think the boards themselves may have an advantage in suppressing owner communication, but that is even more anti-democratic than some of the practices we're talking about today.
Yeah, I guess I'm throwing it out to the group because I see this a lot. I have people saying to me, well, you know, I want to get my voice out. I want people to know we're in an election, but it's like I can't say anything to anyone. I can't go to their unit. Like, it's just like, what am I? So if we're going to embrace technology as it relates to the vote, perhaps there should be a thought about how do you embrace technology so that people can actually tell others that they're running. and to do that in a secure way. I don't know.
So I'm going to say this,
Shane,
Sean,
or Rod?
Sean, if we go back to the old days when people had phone books, if you remember that, and so you had in some condo corporations, people would put together like a phone book of some kind, and I would have to consent to that. And I think the same should continue to apply. Don't give my email address to all the kooks that live at the same postal code as I do. I don't want that. I don't want to get emails from everybody. And so it should be based on I think on consent before we start sort of giving access to these platforms.
Shane, you have anything? You were laughing.
Yeah, no, it's good that it's true. You know, that the idea of the kooks getting your email is not great. I just was going to point out like the regulatory thing that was raised to me, and it may be relevant here too. Like, you know, in the last round of changes, they changed it so that condo managers can't solicit for proxies, right?
Right.
But it's funny if you look at something like some of the providers, you know, whose job it is to help you obtain quorum. Just signing up a provider who is going to ping every single owner in the building with the email you've provided them constantly to remind them to vote, that could be seen as solicitation. Now, you're not asking for a specific vote. You're not soliciting to get like vote for this candidate who I like, but like you're going to have to start to think about like what is, if you're going to regulate who's allowed to ask for people to vote, and you have early voting, this starts to raise questions about, well, what are the rules for who can ask what? Like, am I allowed to sit in the lobby and clang the bell and say come and vote, or is that soliciting? You know, like if I sit next to you and send you a reminder to vote for the board, and then I send you 6 pictures of my preferred candidates, you know, is that soliciting? Like, it's hard to be clear exactly what the solicitation rule means in a digital environment. So I just think there's more complexity. As I said, I just think they need to make it simpler, and everybody needs to agree. Again, right now, every single condo board has the ability to set some of these rules around, you know, what platform they're going to use and what that platform can do individually, and each platform can decide what it's going to do and what it's going to provide individually. You know, in the case of my story, we had some follow-up after the fact, like, we're changing our policies. Like, well, that's great that you say you're changing your policies, but it doesn't change the fact that you could change them back tomorrow to something else, and there's no one to stop you. There's no governing body. So that's kind of the challenge I think we have.
Some condos, just for our participants, some condos do have election bylaws that deal with how they are going to deal with things such as solicitation. Some have no language. Some condos rely on the general language in the deck or rules about, you know, harassment, for example, or contacting others. But you know, if you really want to be clear about it, a bylaw saying these are how we allow either electronic or in-person solicitation. It's just, from my perspective, it's a problem because a lot of people, especially now in COVID, have said to me, like, I don't have a lot of ways to getting my message out. And we feel really strongly about running for a board, but we don't know how to tell anyone. And then unfortunately, by the time you get to an election itself, sometimes a lot of people have already voted. It's too late.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point because, you know, we always talk about, and when I say we, a lot of people in the industry, that condo is the 4th level of government. Below your federal, your provincial, your municipal, then you've got your own little condominium. I like this discussion on who should be soliciting proxies. When it was proposed that managers should not be involved in the solicitation of proxies, to me that just made sense. This is an annual general meeting of the owners. It's the owners' meeting. Certainly, management are there to help coordinate, to help, you know, in some instances they can help chair, but we try not to chair because, you know, it's the owners' meeting. The owners should chair the meeting, but in terms of accessibility, not everybody is comfortable public speaking. Not everybody is comfortable doing that role. So, you know, they may in fact ask the manager to assist with that. But certainly as someone who lives in a condominium community, you know, you need to create that community yourself. You can't rely on others. And I understand, William, the frustration of not being able to go into different people's floors and knock on the doors, but maybe that's why the reason that someone bought in that condo in the first place is they like that added security. They like that, and that's their choice. And Rod doesn't want his email being sent out without consent. So there are other ways in this day and age of creating community. Maybe you throw a party and you invite people to it and you talk about some of the issues that are in the building, and there are other ways to go about it. That's why I went back to the original statement as a manager. You know, you've got to have trust, transparency, and communication. So you need to create that within a community to be successful. So I still stand firm. I don't think the manager has a role in soliciting proxies. If a third, you know, because there is, you know, the way it was explained to me is the potential for conflict. As in, if I'm hiring a third party just to go out and get people to vote, they don't care. They don't care if it's in their vested interest to make sure enough people show up, because that's what they're sort of, that's the claim. That's the whole reason you use that sort of a service. But I think it's good that managers are not involved in that side of the owners meeting.
Claudia wants to speak.
Thank you. So I agree with Julian. Obviously, trust and transparency are necessary, but they have to be demonstrated, and it can't just be rhetoric, right? And from the perspective of what I mean, the extreme perspective of the way William illustrated it, and to Rod's point around consent, we're talking not so much about such a visible suppression of votes, but we're talking perhaps about the ability to influence. And that ability to influence comes through different flavors of what people call consent, because you've got the usual passive implied consent, and you have more informed consent, and then the law talks about what is meaningful consent. Well, if you get to the point where meaningful consent takes center stage, then you have to demonstrate an understanding, and to multiply that by the number of people, data subjects, well, that certainly starts to look like work. It starts to look like effort, but that's what it takes to build trust and to demonstrate transparency. It's those more covert attempts at influencing votes that I draw our attention to, because it's so easy to influence things just by saying, hey, you know what, you couldn't slip a paper under that door. Well, there's a get together, wine and cheese, where I think there'll be posters all over the walls and subliminal messages. These types of things are now all over our society. We see ourselves being influenced by YouTube ads, or even our TVs and our Alexas that are listening to us, and so on. And eventually my Alexa pipes up and says, yeah, I ordered some diapers for you, don't worry about it. Or I voted on this election for you, just don't bother changing the station or pausing your program. I voted for you, because I know what you want anyway. So these are the types of surreptitious data collection that takes place, and influence that can be exercised if you've got information, if you have identities, access to people, access to an audience, and certainly if you have access to an audience, you can build that forum and that community and have those discussions. But it's important to watch out for these elements that could influence people one way or the other.
That's great. We're gonna have to wrap up. I know just because of the timing, we like to stick to what we said was going to be the end time. But what I do suggest for anyone who's listening, who's taking part in this, we'll have a link to it, a recording of this later on as well. If anyone has anyone that they want to pass this on to, who would be interested in the session. But we encourage our contact information. If there are questions from the group that come in after, happy to forward those to the panel, and just really encourage everyone to, whether you're a manager talking to a board, or a board member talking to your manager, or an owner speaking, just keep this conversation going. These issues are not going to be resolved all today, but at least if you talk about it and think about it, and think, how can we protect our privacy of our residents and have well-run elections, you're ahead of the game. Okay, so I want to thank so much our panel for taking part in this. This was great. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Rod, sorry about the technological issue, but you made it, so that's great. And thank again our sponsor, Condo Law, and everyone on the board and who's helped with this event, and the speakers. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
See you later.
Thanks, everybody. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good one.